Hello, it's Friday the 19th of November. You're watching Scotland at 7 with me, Hugh Stewart, and I'm joined tonight with my colleague Brian Liddy. Evening, Brian. So we're going to first of all go through the coronavirus figures, then we're going to look at today's main news headlines, and we're going to spend a bit of time looking at Brexit as we come up to the difficult Christmas trading period. We're going to look back on the year so far. But let's begin now with today's coronavirus numbers, Brian, if you don't mind. I'll just go over the figures again. As of 2 p.m. today, a total of 3,606,612 people in Scotland have been tested through the NHS Scotland labs and the UK Government regional testing centres. Of these, 2,907,650 have been confirmed negative, and 698,962 have tested positive. There were 3,090 new cases of COVID-19 confirmed by a test today, although not everyone with the virus will display symptoms, and not all those with symptoms will be tested. There are 19 new reported deaths of people who have tested positive. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 9,467. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Of the people who have tested positive, 785 were in hospital last night, 64 of whom were in intensive care. As of 8 o'clock this morning, 4,335,881 people have received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, and 3,935,095 have received their second dose, and now 1,342,841 have received their third dose, their booster dose. And Brian, I'm one of those. I'm glad to tell you, right? The latest UK daily figures show that 143,559 patients who tested positive have sadly died from their illness. And that's an increase of 199 since yesterday. That number referring to deaths in all settings and not just hospitals. Okay, Brian, so we're going to spend about 15-20 minutes or so on today's news headlines as we've received them at Broadcasting Scotland. Now, first of all, we've got the story that anti-independence MSPs in Parliament are accused of uniting to take powers back to Westminster. The SNP has accused anti-independence politicians of supporting taking back control from the Scottish Parliament and handing it to Westminster after they failed to condemn the UK Tory government's power grab. In what the SNP describe as a sign of contempt for devolution, Tory MSP Donald Cameron claimed during a Holyrood debate that there should be no limit on where Westminster decides to spend money in Scotland, even in the face of devolved responsibilities. During the debate, MSPs had the opportunity to back the Scottish Parliament and its devolved powers in spite of a Tory power grab. But Labour, Lib Dems and Tories all voted in favour of undermining the Scottish Parliament and its powers. Commenting for the SNP, a member of the Scottish Parliament, Michelle Thompson, said, "This decision will haunt Labour for years to come as it shows how they continue to sink into the abyss in Scotland by working in lockstep with the Tories to undermine the democratically elected Scottish Parliament." She said she found it sad that two of the political parties who had campaigned for so long for Scotland to have its own parliament have now teamed up with the Scottish Conservatives, who had opposed devolution tooth and nail to cut Holyrood's powers. Ms Thompson said she was not surprised that Tories are unable to express support for the future of the Scottish Parliament, as the UK government's constant attempts to undermine devolution have been plain for all to see, with the blatant power grab after power grab. But she thought it was outrageous that Labour and the Lib Dems should support the Tories, particularly in the face of the extraordinary comments from a Tory MSP, Donald Cameron, that Westminster should decide how money is spent in devolved areas. "We know only too well what happens when the Tories decide how to spend money in Scotland. They decide to cut, they decide to hand out public contracts to their donors, and they decide to take money from communities that need it to benefit their own area, said Ms Thompson. Okay, so there's quite a lot in there, Brian, and we're going to return to the question of the power grab, the so-called power grab, and the UK the UK internal market bill later on. Well, why are Labour doing this? Why are Labour, who in fact are a party who created the Scottish Parliament, why are they backing the Tories and taking powers away from Scotland?
It's a good question, Hugh, and it's one that I'm really not sure what the answer is. What I can say is it's not a surprise. It mimics what's been happening in councils throughout Scotland, where Labour and the Tories have been joining forces to keep the SNP out of control of when they've won by elections in places like Aberdeen. I think Michelle Thompson is right when she says that Labour will be remembered for this. And again, casting our mind back to before the independence referendum, when Labour united with the Tories to form Better Together. Again, it's just they have form, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say. It's a surprise in that I agree that power should be devolved down to councils, and I would like to think that Labour and the Scottish Tories would agree with that, as it seems like common sense that the people who know how to spend money are the people that live in that area. And so for Labour and the Tories to then vote to send power in the opposite direction, to send it up to Westminster, further away from where the money needs to be spent, to me it just doesn't make sense.
It's the opposite of devolution. Yes, well, we will be returning to this question of concentrating power in London, particularly post-Brexit. So that's going to come up later on today, because later on tonight we're going to discuss Brexit so far. But I think you're right, Brian. There's a big trap opening up for Labour. They have the opportunity to stand by Parliament, to stand by the Holyrood Parliament, which they themselves created. But so they have, if you like, political capital. Yes. Invested in Parliament.
Yeah, our First Minister was a Labour.
Of course.
First Minister.
Well, two of them, in fact, obviously.
First and second.
Why are they trading in all that capital by, apparently giving their consent to the power grab? So, odd to see what the political strategy is there from Scottish Labour. However, we'll move on to the next story. We are going to return to that later on, the power grab. The second story tonight, the Scottish Government publishes an evidence paper on extension to the vaccine certification. Okay, the Scottish Government has published a paper that brings together the evidence about COVID certification. This paper reports on the operation of the current certification scheme, reviews the approaches adopted by other countries, and examines the evidence behind expanding the scheme. It considers COVID transmission, public attitudes, and the impact on the business community. Deputy First Minister John Swinney said, "With cases rising gradually and pressures on our NHS, our approach is to keep people safe and get through a challenging winter without having to reintroduce any restrictions." The paper provides an update of the evidence on the vaccine certification scheme and focuses on the potential impact of a range of options for expanding it. Mr Swinney said that the vaccine certification scheme is working well, with venues and events affected continuing to operate, and more than 1.5 million downloads of the NHS COVID status app so far. The Deputy First Minister said, "We want businesses to remain open throughout the Christmas period, so it is sensible to consider options available to expand COVID certification. We will continue to consult with hospitality industry representatives and will set out our proposed approach next week. If a decision is taken to extend the scheme, it's expected that the changes would come into effect from December the 6th. Well, there's a couple of points there, Brian. First of all, let's return to the COVID figures earlier on. When I've been reporting over the last couple of weeks, we generally had about 2,500 infections, and that seems to be creeping up now to around 3,000. So does it look like Nicola Sturgeon is worried with the threat of winter?
That sounds like it would be a reasonable assumption to make, Hugh. Numbers are creeping up in Scotland, and autumn's drawing to a close. Winter is coming, as they say, which means we have to be cautious. But I think to counter that, I think the basket of measures that the SNP have put in place means that in general in Scotland we have the lowest figures overall within the UK. The last time I saw some figures said that if you're in Scotland and 1 in 80 people have got COVID or likely to have COVID, whereas the figures are like 1 in 40, 1 in 50 in other parts of the UK. It's good news that there is now evidence that the Deputy First Minister can now produce when he's challenged, as he has been recently in the mainstream media and in Holyrood, when people have asked him to prove that the certification works, and he's declined not to say that there is proof, but it's part of a basket of measures which is working. But if this can help him to continue to support the certification, then I think that's a good thing. Anything I think that helps us keep control of the virus with the upcoming winter is a good thing.
Yes, of course, and it is evidence-based. The important point about this announcement today is that John Swinney is seeking advice from experts. They're saying, what is working? How are they doing it in other European countries? How can we improve? Now, a figure that strikes me from that report we just read out is that 1.5 million downloads of the NHS app have already been achieved. So it is working. People are using it. And the strange thing is, when you talk about the business community maybe objecting, if a business is now full of people who have all been admitted having shown the app, that means they're relatively safe. Of course, there's always a possibility of somebody being infected since. But why should any business complain about having safe customers inside the premises? Surely that's to their own benefit. That helps them keep the business open.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, certainly, the way I think about it is that, I mean, personally, I haven't downloaded the app yet, but that's because I don't really go out very much. I'm a bit of a bidey in, but certainly if businesses do want to coax me out and to coax me into their premises to part with cash, I'm more likely to do that if they have the app and if they look at my app, and if I know that everybody else in that space along with me has had a booster jag, for example, then I'm more likely to feel at ease and spend longer and part with more cash. So I don't understand why they wouldn't want to support this.
Yes, I'm sure a lot of people will look at it that way. So as we said, that report is going to look at evidence from throughout Europe. Now let's turn to Austria. We've heard a lot of Austria and Germany getting a bit worried about the increased infections. So looking at Austria's plans for compulsory COVID vaccination as the whole country goes into lockdown. Austria is to become the first European country to make vaccinations against COVID-19 mandatory, and will go into its third nationwide lockdown for at least 10 days, starting next Monday. Alexander Schallenberg, the Chancellor, has announced this today. The Austrian government said it was preparing the legal groundwork for a general vaccine mandate to come into effect from the 1st of February, with exemptions for those unable to receive a jag on medical grounds. The age from which people will be required to be vaccinated has not yet been determined, the government said. Those refusing to be vaccinated are likely to face administrative fines, which can be converted into a prison sentence if the fine cannot be recovered. Austria is weathering its most powerful wave of COVID, with authorities on Friday reporting 990 cases per 100,000 people over 7 days. It recorded another 15,809 new infections on Friday. The country has the lowest vaccination rate in Western Europe, with only 66% of its population fully vaccinated. 60% fairly low. I haven't looked in the last couple of days, but I believe the vaccination figure for Scotland is something around 80%. And Scotland has a slightly better vaccination rollout than England and the other countries. So we're a couple of percent ahead of everyone. I remember, Brian, before the vaccination came out, health experts were asked, well, what percentage do you need for immunity? Is it 70, 80, 90? Well, it looks like 80 is not enough, and certainly 66% is not enough. So it looks like all countries will have to make sure they've got at least 90% of their population vaccinated. Do you think the low figure in Austria is I don't know an awful lot about Austria. I've not been there for a while. I wonder if there's a serious doubt about medical advice. I wonder if people are listening too much to daft anti-vax websites.
Yeah, I can't really explain why the figures are so low there either, but I think the low figures perhaps explains this kind of measure that's being taken by the government. Clearly, they're desperate to get the number of vaccinations back up. I mean, the measures kind of make me bristle a little bit. You know, if I was living in Austria, I think I'd sort of think, is this really, you know, the right way to go? But it comes on the back of the recent legislation. I think that they brought, was it legislation or plans where they said that if somebody refused to have vaccination, then they would be put into mandatory lockdown. I think this is probably the way out of that situation. I think that would be perhaps even worse. Now the government seems to be saying, we're going to insist that you take this vaccination, but as a result, you won't need to be going into a mandatory lockdown without the vaccination, if that makes sense.
But it is happening throughout Eastern Europe. We've also got a lot of countries to the east of Austria, including, for example, Ukraine, have very high levels of infection and very low levels of vaccination. I can't really attribute it, but I have read 2 or 3 cases recently where people in Eastern Europe, doctors have said, everybody in my COVID ward is unvaccinated. Everyone that I've got who's in intensive care is unvaccinated. In fact, I think it was just 2 weeks ago I read a story about a lady in intensive care in Romania, and this lady was saying to her daughter, you know, I wish I had taken the vaccination now. Yeah. So she'd been reading the wrong advice.
Yeah, I would say so. I'm sure I've heard the same kind of statements being made by British medical practitioners when they've, you know, given a description of the people that are in their intensive care units. Then most of them are unvaccinated. So I think really, I can understand why people might be cautious, you know, because it's not like previous vaccinations that have been about for decades and everybody's used to them and is happy to take them. This one did appear quite quickly in terms of vaccinations, but I just don't. For me, the risk is too great to not take it. Is just not a good idea. So it's better to take it and be protected.
Well, I think in
my opinion.
Well, the way I look at it, Brian, is if I've got a problem with my central heating, I'll probably call a plumber. But if I want medical advice, I'll probably ask a doctor. So
yes,
I'll stick
absolutely.
I'll stick with the experts. Now let's move on to a different story. You may have heard this week, and quite a difficult story coming out of China. The tennis star Peng Shuai, the United Nations has called on China to prove where she is. Is she safe? Is she free? The United Nations has called on the Chinese authorities to prove the whereabouts of Peng Shuai, as photos purporting to show the tennis player were released by a state-affiliated journalist claiming the images were from Peng's own social media account. It would be important to have proof of her whereabouts and well-being, and we would urge that there be an investigation with full transparency into her allegations of sexual assault. Liz Throssell, a spokesperson for the United Nations Rights Chief Michelle Bachelet, said in Geneva today. Peng, who's a former doubles world number 1, has not been seen in public since she accused a former high-ranking official, Zhang Goli, of sexual assault on the 2nd of November. Shortly after the United Nations call, a Chinese state-affiliated journalist, Sheng Shuwei, revealed a set of photos which he said were posted on Peng's WeChat social media account on Friday. The release of the images follows mounting concern for Peng's well-being. The Women's Tennis Association said today it's prepared to pull its tournaments out of China if there was not an adequate response to her sexual assault allegation against the former senior Chinese politician. In a lengthy 2nd of November post on Weibo, which was later deleted, half an hour later in fact, Peng alleged that Zhang had forced her into sex after inviting her to his house to play tennis with him and his wife. That was 3 years ago. She also said that she and Zhang had previously had an on-off consensual relationship. Peng also said in the post that she could provide no evidence to back her allegations but was determined to speak out. Neither Zhang nor the Chinese government have commented on Peng's allegations, and discussion of the topic has now been blocked on China's heavily censored internet. Well, Brian, I haven't anything to add to what we know. So allegations have been made, and the tennis player has not been seen in public for some time. So all we do know is that media, including digital media, is highly controlled in single-party communist China, of course. So maybe China's not really so much of a communist economy. Looks a pretty capitalist economy. However, politically, it's clearly a one-party state. And we're talking about Weibo here. I believe a few years ago, Chinese government decided to reject Facebook, and they said we've got our own version of it, Weibo, but they control it. So her account, Pang's account on Weibo was taken down. So I don't know what else I have to say about that, except single-party states with the same person in power for 20 or 30 years. Not so good, eh?
Yeah, it is concerning. All I can say, again, I don't have much to add. All I can say is that I really hope that she turns up, and it turns out that she's gone on holiday and forgot to take her charger for her mobile phone. Seriously, I just hope she's okay. What can I say? It seems to me that it's a reasonable claim for people to make that they want proof or some kind of inquiry into what's possibly happened to the tennis player. Although I would imagine the last person that I would want to carry out any investigation would be the Chinese government. Surely it would have to be carried out by an independent police investigation or the like. But yes, it's...
Well, let's just hope that people like Broadcasting Scotland and the other news media shining a light on this, will maybe force the Chinese government to say, yes, here she is, and let's see her out walking about freely.
Yeah, a safe outcome is what we want.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on now. Anyway, so to the next story. We'll see if we get any more movement on that one over the next couple of days. Now, the other big crisis that's been developing over the last couple of weeks in Europe is, of course, the Belarus-Poland border. Lukashenko admits Belarus helped migrants cross into the EU. Today, we've heard that Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko has acknowledged that his troops probably helped Middle Eastern asylum seekers cross into Europe. In the clearest admission yet, that he engineered the new migrant crisis on the border with the EU. In an interview with the BBC at his presidential palace in Minsk, he said it was absolutely possible that his troops helped migrants cross the frontier into Poland. He denied being responsible for a migrant crisis, but admitted to letting asylum seekers through Belarus to the EU's borders because they're not coming to my country, they're going to yours, he said. Belarusian state media teased the interview on Friday as Lukashenko has sought to showcase his direct contacts with Western leaders and media despite his increasing international isolation. You know perfectly well it's going to be interesting, a state media Telegram channel wrote, saying Lukashenko had spoken with a major Western news outlet. Representatives of opposition leader Svetlana Chernovskaya criticised the BBC interview for giving a floor to the dictator. Now, there's a couple of issues there. So, we don't hear an awful lot from Lukashenko, and suddenly he comes out. Obviously, Brian, really making sarcastic remarks, isn't he? Did you engineer this crisis? Did you fly refugees and wine and dine them and then bust them to the Polish border? And he says, probably. Yes, he's got some sense of humour, hasn't he, Lukashenko?
Yeah, so I'm not as well up on this as I would like to be, but it seems to me that he's using the situation almost to gain some kind of leverage. The fact that Poland is the outer, part of the outer border of the European Union, it's almost as if he's trying to blackmail maybe the rest of the EU in that if you want me to control the border to the European Union, then you're going to have to pay attention.
Well, it is tit for tat, yeah. First of all, of course, the origin of this story is obviously his election last year. He did extremely well in the elections last year. Some of the people who were trying to stand against him weren't able to mount a successful campaign. So the EU has not recognised Lukashenko as the elected president. So we use, in fact, Chernovskaya herself called him the dictator. So maybe that's a language we should use. Nobody in the West thinks that he won that election fair and square. So because he refused to rerun the election or stand down, and in fact, he didn't even release the political prisoners. There's still hundreds of people in jail who took part in protests. So because of all that, the EU has, first of all, imposed sanctions against Lukashenko, but he's been backed by Moscow. And it looks to me like they've said, well, what can we do to hurt the EU? And so that's what they're doing. They've opened up this massive refugee crisis. But it is, of course, looking pretty shabby, isn't it? So we've seen those pictures and we've heard that people are dying. It's freezing. So it does put the EU in the spot, but maybe it's putting Lukashenko under even more of a spot because it's quite transparent what he's done. He has engineered this crisis himself.
Yes, and I think it's maybe also putting the BBC on the spot. The comment in your news item there about how it's giving the BBC is giving the floor to a dictator. I think maybe the problem isn't about giving the floor to a dictator. It depends on how the news is covered by the BBC, and I think they need to perhaps be a bit more critical of what's going on there, and it's. Yeah. Okay.
So I think this story is going to continue anyway, but it is
sure.
partly an EU border story, and there'll be more of that. And yes, it is. Poland is the eastern border of the EU, so it's if you like, a weak spot that Lukashenko's decided to attack. So we'll see how that develops over the next couple of days. We're going to go across to America now. Since he was here in this city a couple of weeks ago, President Joe Biden's been very busy. So we're going to report now on the US House, the House of Representatives, passing President Biden's social spending bill of $1.75 trillion. Okay, President Joe Biden has passed a budget of $1.75 trillion to bolster the social safety net and fight climate change. It passed the House of Representatives today and now heads to the Senate, where divided moderates and liberals still need to reach agreement. The House passed a measure on a 2020 to 2013 vote, which was postponed for hours by an angry overnight opposition speech from the top Republican in the chamber. Elated Democrats, however, gathered on the House floor to cheer the vote with waves of applause, while disgruntled Republicans called for order. Now, the Build Back Better Act goes to the United States Senate, where I look forward to it passing as soon as possible so I can sign it into law, President Biden said in a statement following the vote. Senate Democrats hope to reach agreement by the end of December, with centrist Democrats Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema, who have raised concerns about the bill's size and some of its provisions. Deliberations over an assortment of prickly issues ranging from tax policy to government-paid family leave benefits are likely to alter the measure before it can pass the chamber. Any defection by any of the Senate's 48 Democrats and the 2 independents who caucus with them would sink the bill, which faces a united Republican opposition. With the initial House passage complete and the recent enactment of the $1 trillion bipartisan infrastructure bill, Biden and his Democrat allies have considerable momentum as the measure approaches the finishing line. Okay, Brian, you know, as they say in America, $1 trillion here, $1 trillion there. Pretty soon you're talking about serious money. Now, it seems to me that these days big spending is back in style, even in America. You know, the old left-right debate used to be the right is low tax, low spend, small government, and the left is doing exactly what Biden has done. But there is an old-fashioned left-right split anyway, because it's basically the Democrats have pushed this through and the Republicans are against it. So it's huge government spending is how we're getting out of the COVID crisis. Build back better, right? Is that how to do it then? Do you think we're not spending enough money in this country?
Yeah, I think you're right. It is the old-fashioned left-right, Labour, Tory, Republican, Democrat. Personally, the way that I see it is, it kind of reminds me of Roosevelt and his New Deal, going back to the 1930s, when the US spent incredible amounts of money to kind of get America out of the recession, and it worked. I think that parties on the right would probably call public expenditure like that subsidy, whereas I would like to think that it's more of an investment. It's going to create jobs. It's going to put money into people's bank accounts and back pockets, which means they're going to be able to go out there and spend that money. So which is capitalism, but it will help, I think, in the situation that we're in. It also kind of makes me, the other thing that's rattling around in my brain is previous President Trump's claims to make America great again, which kind of rang hollow. And I'd like to think that this would be the opposite, and it really will be money well spent in the right place, and it really will help.
I think that's a very good point. Yes, it is back to the New Deal. And although America is always described as the centre of free market capitalism, if you like, but there's always been a huge amount of American government involvement. And the highways, the big dams were built by public money back in the New Deal days, and this seems to be just as big.
It happened in this country on a smaller scale when right after the IRA bombed Manchester city centre. I was living there at the time, and I remember the government decided, they said we will not be defeated, and they threw a lot of money at Manchester city centre. And if you go through Manchester city centre now, it's incredible, the change that's happened since then, and it just shows what money can do. It is investment. It really wasn't subsidy. It's kind of. Mm-hmm. It works.
Yep. Yes, I know. I mean, even Rishi Sunak in his recent budget did say that government spending is okay if it's for investment. So that seems to be, again, to use that word in the story, bipartisan. There's in America there is some agreement between Republicans and Democrats. It's not complete, but indeed after World War II, of course, America and Britain and Europe, of course, was reconstructed by government money. Yeah, huge amounts of money was spent in rebuilding economies. And just before we move on, just having a look back at COP26 in Glasgow last week, people have been saying COVID shows that governments can spend billions, in fact trillions, if they want to. So why don't they do the same for climate change? We know we can do it. If we can do it for COVID, we can do it for climate change too. Well, again, that's a story that's obviously going to come back again. Why about in America? One final story before we have a look at Brexit, Brian. This just came in just before we went on the air. I've been following the news for a couple of days now of the jury trial in the Kenosha case. Now, this takes us back last year, Brian, to a Black Lives Matter protest. In Wisconsin, if I've got this right, yep, there was a young man who's now 18, I think, went to a demonstration in Wisconsin, Kenosha town. He went with a machine gun, and at the end of his evening, he shot 3 people, killing 2 of them. So this happened last year. Now, he claimed self-defense. Now, before we go any further, I have to say that the jury today, in fact, we just heard half an hour ago, the jury has returned the verdict. He's not guilty. Now, the prosecution argued that for it to be self-defense, you have to be under attack, an attack that you did not provoke. If you went and caused the attack, and then you get attacked, and then you shoot somebody, that tends to reduce your self-defense argument. However, that's not for us to argue. The jury spent 3.5 days deliberating, and he's not guilty. So that really goes back to Black Lives Matter. But the interesting thing here is this isn't really a black-white issue, because I think the 2 people killed were both white people. He's white. So he went from his hometown in Illinois over to Kenosha, Wisconsin, basically as a vigilante. Shot 3 people, 2 of them are dead. So, and he is a member of a vigilante right-wing organisation. However, he wasn't accused of that. He was accused of manslaughter or homicide. Anyway, he's not guilty, so we can't argue with the jury, can we? But nonetheless, this raises a lot of issues. Why do young men in America feel that they have to go to another state to defend themselves against somebody? So he successfully found 3 people to defend himself against, and the 2 of them are dead.
It sounds incredible. Again, I'm not as well up on this story as you are, Hugh, but it's all I can do is I'm kind of looking. I want to go and find out, who was in the jury. I don't know. It's kind of it's quite staggering, really. It's it seems clear from what you're saying that he did do it. I take it there's
Yes.
CT.
Yes, well, there's
TV
no
camera
doubt. Yes, there's
footage.
plenty of evidence. He went there, and yes, there is footage of him shooting. At least two. I think two of the shootings are actually on film, and his defence was able to argue because it was a demonstration that was angry. People were shouting, and people. Well, one guy did throw something at him. In fact, it was a plastic bag containing his toothbrush and shaving gear. So this plastic bag was thrown at him, so he felt he was under threat, so he shot the guy. But he is a member of a right-wing group, and he did make racist comments. The other things you raised are about the jury. All we know, it was mainly a white jury, and there is complaints about the way the judge leant on the jury. So this raises a lot of issues, but as I said before, we weren't there. The jury has made that decision.
Yeah, I would say the main thing is that it's more evidence that America needs to reform its gun laws, and there needs to be stricter controls.
They sure do. They sure do. Strange thing, in spite of the power of the gun lobby, many polls I've seen, although maybe I just get my evidence from Michael Moore, many polls I've seen show that most Americans would like to do something to tighten up gun control. And so, well, anyway, the man in question, by the way, the not guilty Kyle Rittenhouse, certainly the jury has decided that his white life does matter, and he's now free. Okay, just before we move on to the Brexit story, well, we were going to do a review of Brexit so far as we head up to Christmas, but I think you've got a story on one of the effects of leaving the European Union. Brian, what did you come up with today?
Yes, and it's a story that doesn't seem to be getting very much coverage in the mainstream media. I'll just read out. So one of the lesser known aspects of Brexit is that the UK has now left what is known as the Dublin Regulation. This is an EU law that determines which EU member state is responsible for processing asylum seekers, all the while being under the protection of the Geneva Convention. Last year, when Britain was still party to the Dublin Regulation, the UK was able to return 289 asylum seekers to other EU countries for processing. This year, our post-Brexit Britain is no longer party to the Dublin Regulation, and as a result, the UK has only been able to return five asylum seekers to another UK country for processing. So, I mean, basically, my take on that is like so much for taking back control of our borders. Seems to be that we've had the opposite effect.
Yes, I seem to remember take back control and control of borders were big planks of the Brexit platform. But I remember back in the old days, there was a shared thing that there used to be a European policy called Mare Nostrum in the Mediterranean, means it's our sea. Everyone in Europe has to share the burden. But again, as I said before about Poland, but the EU's not been very good at sharing that burden, has it? But Britain has no one to share it with now. They're on their own. Now, talking of Brexit then, Brian, we decided at the end of this week to look forward, if you like, to what's going to happen over Christmas and into 2021. We always hear, of course, of supply difficulties, and some of those may be caused by COVID, but really it comes down to Brexit. It comes down to shortage of staff, shortage of lorry drivers, and anyway, even if you do actually have a lorry driver, it's border controls. So let's have a look at a slide so we can review what Brexit is all about. So I've shown you here, Brian, first of all, what have we left when Britain left the single market? The EU single market, by the way, was constructed by Britain. People often forget about that. It was Britain's idea. Britain and the other EU countries spent years figuring out how to make the single market complete. And it meant really the four freedoms. Freedom of movement of goods. That means you can sell stuff anywhere. You can move across borders with no restriction at all. The same goes for capital. If you want to invest in Lithuania or Poland, you just do it. There's no restriction. And the same applies for services. If you want to provide an insurance business in another country, nothing to stop you. And finally, of course, freedom of movement of persons. Under the four freedoms, the EU 27 citizens can go anywhere they like, no questions asked. They can apply for a job where they go. They can set up a business. So those are the four freedoms which Britain and the EU helped to establish. And I don't know if you remember when that came in, Brian. I was teaching business studies then, and everyone was looking forward to the 1st of January 1993. That was a big date in everyone's diaries when we completed the single market. Okay, so we've left it. That's what we've left. So the reason we're doing this programme now as a kind of a look back is also to look forward, because if you look at the timeline again, the Brexit referendum was 2016, wasn't it? And then I think Theresa May finally wrote the letter saying we're going to leave on, I think it was 2019. But no, we didn't leave in 2019. We actually left really January this year, 2021. However, even that isn't the end of the story, because we're in various transition periods. So one by one, different industries are going to move out of the single market, and one by one, more of the restrictions are going to come in, starting about now, and more restrictions coming in over January through to spring of 2022. So I remember somebody saying that they were going to get Brexit done and there was an oven-ready deal, but it's getting a bit cold in the oven just now. So that's what we've lost. We've left the EU single market, which we helped to create. So let's look at some of the issues. Now, what I'm going to do now, Brian, I've just had a look at the Scottish Government's position paper. This is on the Scottish Government website. So if we can just look at some of the issues the Scottish Government flags up. Right, this is on a screen now. I should have made it a bit bigger. So this is from academic sources which have been quoted by the Scottish Government, and people can look at this on the Scottish Government website. On the economy, Brexit has already made Scotland's economy smaller. The Johnson deal, which he got ready for his election, is a FTA. It's a free trade agreement, which sounds good, but it's not as good as being in the single market. And it could make the economy smaller in Scotland by £9 billion by 2030. That's a fall of 6.1% on the size of the Scottish economy. Now, last year, the Scottish Government warned that going ahead with Brexit during the COVID pandemic was irresponsible, but they went ahead anyway. Now, Scotland, of course, is part of the UK economy, and this is numbers from the ONS, that's the Office of National Statistics in London. If you compare 2018 before the pandemic to the first quarter of 2021, which is sort of after the pandemic, I suppose, after the lockdown anyway, we see that the trade, this is the imports plus exports, the kind of dimensions of the tradable economy, trade has gone down from £266.4 billion to £237 billion. So that's a fall of nearly £30 billion. That's in the first quarter of the year, this year, compared to when we were still in a single market, to all intents and purposes. So there's clearly a fall in trade in the UK economy. But as we'll show in a minute, Brian, that actually has an even worse effect on the Scottish economy. We'll come to that in a minute. Now, just before you say, Brian, I know you're a sceptical chap, you're going to say to me, but Hugh, isn't that fall of 30 billion in trade, isn't that because of COVID? Well, COVID was still in effect in 2021, obviously. However, the Scottish Government shows that our trade with the rest of the world fell by 4%, which is presumably COVID related, but our trade to the EU fell by 19%. So yes, it's about COVID, but even more, it's about Brexit.
Yes, and you're right, I am a bit of a sceptic. Diogenes the cynic even. In my universe, the glass is half empty, because there used to be more in there, and now it's down here, so it's half empty. There's no doubt about it. Correct me if I'm wrong. It seems that I've seen figures recently that said that the effect of COVID on the economy is going to be huge, as it is for every country. But apparently, the effect of Brexit on our economy is going to be much larger than that of COVID, and so we've got the two combined. So it's an incredible state of affairs. And again, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that the reason that we haven't still quite left the European Union is that Westminster, it seems to me that they look ahead and they see what is going to happen, and it's negative, and they extend deadlines and they extend deadlines. I think I'm right in saying that the EU has implemented Brexit. So if you trade with the EU, or if you want to travel to the EU, then they've put Brexit in place. Whereas Westminster, because they want to mitigate the bad effects of Brexit, they just keep kicking it down the line. And we've got open borders at the moment, basically. If you want to trade from the EU into the UK, there are no restrictions. So we have not taken back control. So it's a staggering state of affairs.
Mm-hmm. So we've left a good bit. We've left a bit that benefited us in the single markets, and we've just got a bit that benefits the European Union. Yes, astonishing. Yeah, again, comparing COVID to Brexit, COVID happened. Maybe we didn't handle it very well, but we didn't start it. But in Brexit, that was actually the British idea. Yes, I wonder what historians of the future will make of that. Now, I'm just going to have a quick run through some of the other issues that the Scottish Government has raised in the paper. Let's look at the effects on the businesses. Now, according to, again, the ONS survey, that's the Office of National Statistics, they've showed that most UK businesses have found that it's very difficult. This is businesses who trade with Europe. Of course, lots of businesses don't trade anywhere. If you've got a hairdresser in your street, they're not affected by imports and exports, of course, but people who do trade, the most difficult problems they face are due to Brexit. That's according to a survey. And looking at Scotland, the Scottish Enterprise surveyed 670 firms, and 41% of them said that the top challenges they face this year are caused by Brexit. And that comes in now, Brian. That's since the end of the transition period, which was this January. So from January onwards, anyone who's exporting is now finding it very difficult, whereas last year in the single market, it was very easy. That's why we built the single market. Now, in Scotland, this is where we have a particular effect. The hard-hitting sectors are such as food and drink. Now, for some, they say we used to send a truckload overnight to France. People, for instance, from the Western Isles could load a freezer container of prawns, and they could be on sale in France or Spain the following day. Now it's taking 3 days. What used to take overnight is taking 3 days. So again, that's why it's a problem. Remember, Johnson's agreed a free trade area. That means there's no tariffs. So those prawns don't pay a tax, maybe, but that doesn't mean they get in free. It means you still have to hold them up. Okay, and of course we're talking about live. It's not so much frozen, of course. They're put on ice, but they're still more or less delivered fresh and live. So you can't do that anymore. But it's whether it's live or fresh or frozen, it's taking 3 days and it used to take 1 day. Okay, so again, this is a measure of how how leaving the single market is. Well, it's not just making it difficult. If you're trying to export fresh fish, it's actually making it impossible, isn't it? So.
Yeah, and my understanding is that, again, I'm happy to be proven wrong. My understanding is that trade was so frictionless that seafood could be plucked from off the coast of Scotland, packed up and delivered and be on the table in restaurants, high-end restaurants in France and Spain and Italy, and it was still live. It was like that was how quickly the journey could be made. And now that's impossible. And if I can, I'd maybe just like to challenge you on your high street hairdresser that doesn't need to trade with the EU.
Yeah, please explain.
I mean, I'm not a businessman. I don't trade, but I would imagine that any business, you might source your most popular hair dyes from a French company that specialises in coiffures or whatever. But
L'Oreal, for example.
L'Oreal, yeah, were worth it. And then for the science part, no. But if you're a business and you need screws and nuts and bolts, and if you're in the EU, if you're France, Germany, Sweden, Sweden's maybe not in the EU, but if you're within the EU or within the common, the customs union, then you used to maybe source nuts and bolts from a British firm, and now that's become difficult. So they just turn to their neighbours within the EU and source it elsewhere. Loss of trade for British companies. So, and likewise, if we want to bring in German hardware, then it's going to be more expensive. It's going to take longer. It's going to be more costly. So it's definitely high street. I think it affects everything, and we're finding that out now with the chemicals that used to be used to treat effluent, which then would go back into the system and safe to drink. It came from the EU, and now we're suffering as a result.
Yes, I accept what you're saying about the hairdressing trade. Well, yes, anyone gets whatever they can from the cheapest. Yeah, you think I should get some L'Oreal? That's something I should look into. But the issue is about ease of access to whatever's cheapest. Yeah, I used to buy things from a big supplier in Germany, and that's become more expensive. You can still get it, but it's more expensive, and it takes longer to get here. Red tape, as it says again on the left of my slide there. Again, according to the Office of National Statistics, 1/3 of manufacturing firms in Scotland have faced increasing costs due to red tape. Now, red tape is a whole thing we got rid of when we set up the single market. Now, let's go back to fish again, because as well as taking back control, which you identified earlier, Brian, I think the other big thing about Brexit is it was about fish for some reason. People in Wolverhampton, the sea fleets of Leeds were wanting to get control of our fish. But the odd thing is that our fish, half the time, turns out to be Scottish fish. Mm-hmm. So let's look at disruption to the seafood sector. So again, this is from the Scottish Government's research. Since January this year, firms have had to learn new processes to deal with all this red tape, to deal with the mountain of paperwork they now have to fill in. And they've also had to buy and upgrade their software and then train their staff into using this software. So what they estimate is each consignment, like each lorry load of fish, is now going to cost £500 or £600 more because of these administrative costs. So in 2019, 70% of Scottish seafood exports were to the European Union. So those fresh fish you were talking about, fresh prawns, worth altogether some 770 million in 2019. And again, most of that, well, look at the figures now. So far this year, seafood exports are 27% down compared to 2018. Okay, so it's all about fish, is it? People said, well, we've got more control of our seas now, all that's debatable, but nobody mentioned you also need customers. The customers are in Europe.
Yeah, I think it all kind of, if you're my age, then I think it kind of harks back to the Cod Wars that the UK had with Iceland in the 1970s, which, if I remember rightly, Britain won, and I think that's why exactly. I think that's why fish became such a big Brexit rallying cry. Earlier on, I said that I'm a big cynic and the glass is half empty, but this is one of the few. I really feel for Scottish fisheries and what they must be going through at the moment. And Scotland, as we've lost, it may have been a tiny sector of the British economy, seafood, Scottish seafood, but it was a hugely iconic brand, and Scotland's lost that. In Europe, it's like you no longer will find people paying over and above the odds for Scottish seafood. And the only benefit that I struggle to see here is that coming after COP26 and climate change and concerns for the environment, if there's less fishing going on, then it means there are more beasts staying in the seas and the shores around Scotland, and that's the only benefit that I can think of.
Again, I don't know anything about that in technical area. I know one of the issues of the common fisheries policy is protection of stocks, but again, I don't know really if we were overfishing or underfishing. But just before we move on to the next slide, we've got to remember in Scotland, there's really quite a big difference between the typical East Coast large-scale industrial fishing and a very small local, 2 or 3 guys in a boat, West Coast fishery. So a lot of the exports we were talking about earlier on were from very small businesses in the West Coast, and a lot of them, frankly, are not going to survive Brexit. Right? So it's really having a disproportionate effect on Scotland, because this is where most of the fishing fleet is, but it's particularly bad for the small local fisheries in the West Coast. So there's your Brexit bonus there. Now let's just see if we've got time to look at another couple of Brexit issues in the story so far. Population, Brian. So this includes the workforce we've discussed earlier on. Now, again, Scotland has a different effect here compared to the rest of the UK. Scotland depends on new people coming in. England doesn't. England has an increase. If there was no immigration, England's population would be growing. Scotland's natural population is not growing. So we need people in Scotland, and they're important for the obvious reason, of course. Usually people coming in are young, but also those young people drive economic growth and they drive productivity. So kind of contrary the research the Scottish Government is looking at, if you take those young people out of the economy, you're going to get a slowdown of growth, and that's going to be effective year after year after year. That slowdown accumulates. So basically what we're saying is Scotland needs new people. Scotland needs young Europeans to come and become new Scots. Now let's look at the actual deficit, the shortage. Food businesses in Scotland can see a reduction in EU workers of 12.1%. Now that's twice the UK number. So again, the UK is losing out because of Brexit, but Scotland is losing out more. And again, the figures say this. We're not making this up. This is what the research reveals. In June 2020, there were 231,000 EU nationals living in Scotland, we think approximately. However, national insurance registrations for the first quarter of this year show so far a 70% reduction. So again, most of those EU people will be young and qualified, contributing and improving the Scottish economy. So large numbers of them are not going to come. And again, it looks like something like 50, maybe even up to 80% fewer of those EU citizens will be in Scotland in the future. So that's another effect of Brexit that we can see now. And again, that's accelerated this year since the transition period ended.
Yeah, I think this is one of the more important effects of Brexit upon Scotland. We really need young people, and the fact that we're being denied, and young people living in other countries are being denied the opportunity to come to Scotland to live here and to work here and to contribute to our society and our economy, and we have no say over that. I really think that is one of the starkest effects of Brexit. What can I say?
I was just going to add on, Brian, it also comes up, of course, in education, in higher education and in research. Now, again, this is maybe one of the things you're thinking of. The Erasmus programme was, of course, set up by the European Union many years ago with the enthusiastic support of Britain and Scottish universities. Erasmus allows European students to come to our universities and study for a term or a full year. And also Scottish students can go to France or Spain or Germany. And again, you've got more or less a free opportunity to go and live and work in Europe. You do get some funding in the old Erasmus scheme. Fees don't have to be paid. If a student from here goes to study in Germany for a term, they don't have to pay 10,000 euros for the fee. So there's no fee, and there's some other expenses. So the Erasmus scheme allows people from a wide range of backgrounds to go and study abroad. And of course, this is particularly useful for people who are studying languages, of course. And also looking at it from the other side, people from throughout Europe have been studying in our universities. Last year, there were 2,755 EU students studying in one of our universities. So, Brian, that means maybe for a term or maybe for a whole year, and then they go back to their own university. So the Erasmus scheme, by the way, is about doing the same sort of subject. So if somebody's studying physics in Germany, they could come to Heriot-Watt and also study physics, and they get the credits and take it back home with them.
Yeah, it's incredibly sad that it's such a lost opportunity. I mean, when I was at university, I for some reason took up the opportunity to go on an exchange to America, and I spent a year studying the same subjects that I would have studied here if I'd stayed in Scotland. And I had never been to America before in my life, and it completely, as you can imagine, it completely changed my views on America, and from quite negative to really very positive, despite the politics that was going on at the time. We're talking about Reagan was on his way out, and so it's Brexit is starting to get them young. It's like there was another story recently which showed that we tend to think about how Brexit has stopped us trading with the EU and vice versa, but because of Brexit, young people who are at school in Europe are no longer able to come on school trips to the UK, which means at a very early age they don't get to come maybe to Scotland and to meet people that live here, and then think one day when they go to university, do you know what, I'm going to do Erasmus and I'm going to go to Scotland, and then maybe they would say, do you know, this has been a great Erasmus thing, I'm going to stay here. And all of those opportunities to get somebody to find out what Scotland's like and stay here, so they've all gone. It's incredibly sad.
Yes, there is that cultural side. Obviously, it's great to go and have the opportunity to live and work in another country. But the other side of it, just before we move on to research, I was just going to say that also that Erasmus actually helps courses to survive in Scotland. Universities are under the pressure to deliver economically, and basically to put on a course you need to have 20 or 25 students or something like that. Now, supposing you're doing a small subject and not too many people do, and you've got 15 students, the university is going to say, cancelled, right? That's not enough. So supposing you've got 10 people from Europe who want to do it as well, suddenly you've got a class. So actually, it's making some courses unviable. Taking those students out of the classroom means a lot of university accountants are going to say, no, you're too expensive, that class is cancelled. So it's not as if those Erasmus students are taking a place away from the Scottish students. They're actually doing the opposite. They're adding and they're increasing their diversity, not only the cultural diversity, but also adding on more courses, a wider range of courses than
so the class is half full in that instance.
Ah, you bet. Now, thank you. I'll have a drink on this. Now, let's just finally on Europe. There's a topic that maybe people don't pay enough attention to. If you look at research, since we're on the university topic, as part of the single market, the UK and Scotland through the UK are part of various research initiatives. Now, typically what happens in university research is that one university will form a consortium with others, and possibly including private firms as well. So a lot of that is facilitated by being in Europe, or it used to be anyway. So there's huge amounts of European research. For example, the Horizon Research Project, which was launched in 2014, saw about 755 million euros of funding going into innovation, and Scottish universities are able to bid, or were able to bid, for a part of that. So that's a huge amount of the UK funding for research in our universities came through that European scheme. There's other European schemes too, such as the satellites which run the sat-navs, and the Copernicus system, and the other one. And so, yes, so let's just have a look at some of the numbers on research. So, okay. So anyway, so we'll move on from research, but anyway, we're losing all of that funding. Now, just finally on Europe, is it a race to the bottom? Now, again, this was argued in Brexit. The critics of Brexit were saying you're only going to do it to bring down prices, to bring down standards. Now, the Scottish Government says that's exactly what you are doing. The Scottish Government fears that over time, UK standards are going to be reduced. Standards in social protection, in animal welfare, and the environment. And in fact, they quote the recent Australian trade deal as an example. Lower standards in Australia for beef, for example. So if their standards are lower, that's why they can put the stuff in the boat, sell it thousands of miles away, and it still arrives here cheaper. So Scottish farmers are now facing unfair competition because really the standard criteria has been taken out of the trade. Now, you can't do that in Europe. Although we've got free trade in Europe, there also is standards. So if you're selling dodgy goods in Spain, you can't expect to export them into Germany. There's got to be equivalent standards. So clearly, being able to leave the EU gives us the freedom to have lower standards. What kind of freedom is that?
Yeah, and you described it as a race to the bottom. I would say it's really more like a drop, like a stone to the bottom. It's straight down. Again, I'm not very good on international trade and the WTO, World Trade Organization, rules and conventions, but my slim understanding is that if we want to trade on WTO terms, which is one of those catchphrases that was bandied about before Brexit and just before the vote, if we give something to one country in terms of a trade agreement, then we've got to give it to every country. So if we say to Australia that we're happy to import their beef which has been treated with antibiotics, then America will say, well, so will we. And if not, they take us to some international court and sue us. So again, it's that feel the sovereignty, take back control. We have no control. I can't. Again, I can't think of a single positive thing to say about the situation that we're in.
Okay, well, yes, we keep on. The people who supported Brexit keep on talking about the UK internal market, and that's a strange construction. I'd never heard of a UK internal market before,
exist.
but as I said, I used to teach when I was a business studies lecturer. I used to teach about the European internal market. So I think that's just a phrase. It does exist, yes.
The British internal one does not.
The British internal market is a kind of a cheap version of it, isn't it? First of all, it's in one country instead of 28, and secondly, in order to try and compete with Europe, well, it has to have low standards. That's
well, also there are no agreements between Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and England. England at Westminster can just say we're just going to, we're just going to give money to. They can just change the rules. It's like there is no agreement. And
let's look at that last point on our slide here. The UK internal market. Now, it was of course already passed through Westminster. The internal market bill says that basically, once a standard is set by Westminster, it's not possible for Scotland to set a different standard. So if, for example, to go back to your beef, right? If, for example, Scottish beef has to be sold free of hormones, free of any other injections,
organic,
or organic, if the UK Parliament then produces easier rules to say, no, this is acceptable, you can put in a bit of that, you can do a bit of this. If the UK government changes the rules, it's not possible for the Scottish government to have a different standard. So that's what the famous UK internal market is all about. It says that London sets the standards. They may be low or they may be very low, but whatever they are, those are the standards for Scotland too, and you'll just have to put up with it.
Yeah, and contrast that with the European Union, where every country has an equal say, and there are rules and there are regulations, and you can do things slightly differently if you want to, as long as you respect the rules of other countries. And that is a trading bloc, an internal market within the EU, and there's no such equivalent arrangement here in the UK.
That's right. It's take it or leave it. Well, we'll have to leave it. And let's look at the numbers. Why are we in this position of Brexit when Scotland didn't actually want it? I think it's important to underline, just as we finish, Brian, that Scotland, of course, voted to remain in the European Union, and presumably for the sort of reasons we've just been discussing for the last 20 minutes. Now, I had to look at some of the actual numbers here. Now, overall, 62% of Scotland voted to remain in the EU, but it was up and down in different cities and different counties. Now, I've looked at three Conservative areas. I mean, Aberdeen City is maybe not Conservative, but the North East is one of the places where Conservative MPs are returned. It's a fish, Brian. So even in Aberdeen City, 61% voted to stay in the European Union. East Dumbartonshire, which again tends to be Tory, that's not the town of Dumbarton, that's the countryside bit. And again, that's usually a Conservative or a Liberal area. It's not Liberal at the moment, but they have been in the past. The former leader of the Liberal Party was, in fact, an MP for there. But 71.4% of East Dumbartonshire voted to stay in the European Union. East Renfrewshire, of course, is also famously a Conservative seat, and again, 74%. And in Glasgow City, again, 66.6%. So Scotland voted very strongly to remain, interestingly enough, even in Conservative areas. And I believe the city of Edinburgh was even more pro-Europe than the city of Glasgow was. So Scotland voted remain, but we're leaving. Well, in fact, we're gradually leaving. We're in this slow, gradual departure from the standards of the European Union, although we voted to stay in it.
Yeah, and I can't really explain those figures, but I wonder if right-wing or conservative voting areas, that might be a rare example of those voters, conservative voters, knowing which side their bread is buttered on. If they're into trade and the like, then maybe they could see that being in the EU is a good thing. And again, I wonder, I know we're coming to the end of our time here, but the converse of that is if you're living and working in a Labour voting constituency, and if you support Labour, then maybe you had some maybe you tended to agree with people that used to accuse Jeremy Corbyn of, which was that he always saw the EU as being against the worker and against trade unions and a free market economy, and therefore a bad thing. So I've no idea, but those are the two thoughts that come to mind with the figures that you cited.
Well, yeah, that's a final point you've raised at the end, which is interesting because this might look like a pro-EU advert, but what we've been looking at tonight is the Scottish Government's assessment of the impacts, the social and economic impacts. And again, we can't see anything that's positive about it. But yes, it is odd when you look at pro-Europe, anti-Europe, pro-business, anti-business, and pro-working class, anti-working class. They sort of overlap. It's not a neat split.
Maybe it's not explicit. Well, it sounds like pro-EU, but maybe it's just showing up Brexit to be the glass is half empty. There was more in there before, and now it's gone.
Absolutely. The glass, yes. Well, personally, my glass is empty now, so maybe that's a visual metaphor, right? So I think, Brian, we've overrun our time here, so it'll be past your tea. So
overstayed our welcome.
I'm sorry if we've kept you too long tonight. We usually try and keep these programmes to an hour, but we thought that as we're looking towards the end of the year and as we're looking forward, Brian, to the rest of Brexit coming in next year, there's going to be some big decisions to be made. So we thought it was worthwhile looking back at the year, because it really is just this year, since January, that Brexit has actually started to bite, and it's going to continue to do that into 22. So thanks for sticking with us if you're still watching. So we've gone over our time a bit. We usually try to keep these programmes to an hour. So can I thank my colleague Brian Liddy here for helping to write the stories tonight and for discussing them with me. And also, of course, finally to thank you. Now, if you are one of our regular viewers and subscribers, well, thanks for watching. It's great to have you on board. Now, as I may have said before, if you are subscribing, then please pass it on. Please tell your friends about Broadcasting Scotland and pass this video on if you're on YouTube or if you're on other social media. Just pass it on and share, because you've got to let people know that if they want independent broadcasting for Scotland, made in Scotland, then I'm afraid you have to pay for it, because we're not getting any government funding. We're not getting any support at all. So it's you. It's you who is watching it, and we're not doing adverts. It's always free to view. So give us a hand, please. And as I've said before, the more money comes in, the more programmes we're going to make. We've got lots of exciting programmes lined up, and as soon as we get the funding, we'll be making them. So we intend to be increasing our output as time goes on. Okay, so thanks for watching, and thanks for funding. And if you can subscribe, if you're not subscribing, please consider doing that and to help us build up Broadcasting Scotland. I think we're going to need independent broadcasting over the next few months, Brian. Okay, some from Hugh, Stewart, and from Brian Liddy. That's it for Scotland at 7 tonight, and we'll see you later. Thanks. Good night.